Flat number 6. Nobody lived in flat number 6. As far as we are aware, it was empty. The date was October 1992. My wife and I had moved in almost 2 months ago. We had bought flat number 5, and were quite content to live in it. It was a neat, cozy little apartment with a kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom, and one room which merged into the living and dining spaces. Not to mention, it came cheap, and was only a 10-minute walk from the train station. Sure, the wallpaper was a little fuddy-duddy, and the kitchen designing was a little 70s, but with a bit of paintwork and a few trips to the furniture store, we would hopefully make it work. The little outer London neighborhood was appealing, too. It was the kind of idyllic suburban place where there was enough traffic on the streets to reassure you that you aren't in the middle of nowhere, and there was little enough traffic to let you get to sleep soundly. The high streets had everything, too. A doctor's surgery, an optician's, a dentist, and a Tesco supermarket. At any rate, we were feeling nicely settled in by the end of 2 months, and had high expectations of our new life in England. You see, we came over from the States, and in spite of the fact that the English speak the same language as Americans, there were aspects of living over here that were entirely alien to us. It was home, but it wasn't quite home. The weather was also something of an issue. Not a disappointment, though, as we'd had a great deal of forewarning about the clouds and the rain that filled England's skies in the autumn, and most times of the year. Perhaps now I should focus back on our new home. Ours was number 5 out of 6 flats, which belonged to a tidy apartment block named the Gretel Cottage. It was situated midway along the street, and held a mix of detached houses, a block of flats, and even a few guest houses. Gretel Cottage had 3 levels to it. On the ground floor, the hallway led to flat 1 on one side and flat 2 on the other. On the first floor, flat 3 shared the landing with flat 4, and likewise flat 5 shared the second floor's landing with, well, flat 6. There were no other levels. In our first week there, we had taken time to get to know the residents of the other flats. Rather, they had taken their time to come upstairs and greet us. They were a friendly lot, for the most part. There was a Miss Miggins in number 4, a Mr. Smith in number 3, a Frenchwoman in number 1, and one other fellow in number 2. Remarkably, none of them could have been younger than 65. I was 24 and my wife 25. Yes, I guess we did feel a little out of key with our neighbors. They never seemed to go out unless for groceries, and that seldom. We went out daily. More remarkably yet, not one of them didn't live alone, widowed or divorced. I suppose it's a lonely time, old age. You get the feeling that nobody wants to talk to you, and you feel detached from your loved ones. Back in our apartment in Ohio, literally all of our neighbors had been young couples or families. There had been a great deal of noise over there. We heard the children's shoes bumping along down the hallways, and a great deal of both grown-up and children's laughter. Sometimes we even heard quarrels, and parents scolding their children, and of course, that meant very loud crying. But we had been surrounded by life and youth, and the place seemed brighter and cheerier. Gretel College was different. It was nice and quiet, so quiet sometimes that it felt lifeless. Perhaps the dreary weather added to it, but the lack of a sound gave the building a subtle loathsome feel about it. It was sad in a way. Actually, it was a bit eerie. The good thing was, we spent less time at home than we did outside. We both worked the standard 9-to-5 office jobs in the inner city, and returned home at about 11. As for the weekends, we went out pretty much all day both days, and came back at times ranging from 6:30 to beyond midnight. When home, we either watched the telly, making dinner, or simply unwinding. Sometimes we went to the gym, sometimes to the cinema. Sometimes we just sat and talked and talked and talked. We had a good time, I'll admit. And then there was flat 6. There was nothing immediately remarkable about it. It had an oaken door and a front porch identical to all the others, with a knocker and a bell and a bristly brown doormat. A brass 6 was fixed in the middle with nails. Nobody had opened the door to greet us on our arrival, and after a week of seeing not a thing go in and out, we assumed the flat was empty. And what could be wrong with that? Nothing, right? Well, I know it sounds childish coming from a man of my age, but there's something very slightly unnerving about an empty house. I'm sure you've all had a house on your street with no dwellers in it, and I'd bet many of you sometimes got the chills when you walked by it in the evening. Come on, admit it. Empty, abandoned houses are creepy. Well, with Flat 6, it was like that, but different. Worse. All day, all night, the empty flat was literally on the doorstep of our home. When we opened our front door to leave in the morning, that ominous door stood there, waiting for us, looming. When we returned home, we would turn the key to the lock and know that the dreaded door was behind us. Imagination would make us wonder, what's in that flat? And what if it opens right now and comes out? Alright, fair enough, that's a bit of an exaggeration. It wasn't really that bad, just a little weird, that's all. I'm ashamed to tell you this, but when I said we and us, I ought to have said I and me, because to be honest with you, my wife didn't feel in the least bit put off by flat 6. Yes, I know, it's shameful, I'm a jumpy, nervous sissy, I admit it. We had different teenage years. She went out and saw the horror films she could, and I saw few enough as to get the creepy side of my mind working, but not enough to dampen my imagination. We still went out for a scary one now and then, but I was never the one who suggested it. Now that I've given you more than enough background knowledge on myself and my life at the time, and now that you have an idea of how brave a man I am, I should hurry up and tell you about some of the things that happened in late October 1992. Nothing truly weird took place until the postman came on Monday. I remember I was sitting at the table with a plate of half-finished scrambled eggs, a cup of tea, and watching the BBC News. There was a scuffling of paper being shoved through the letterbox, and the damp clink as it fell shut. My wife was back in a moment with 2 letters. One of them, she explained, was an advert from the insurance company, and the other was a bill. She left them on the table and returned to breakfast and the news. So far, so good. Then a few minutes later, we tidied up, switched off the television, and stepped outside. Something struck me as off as soon as we locked the door behind us. It hit me in a second. There was an envelope lying on the doormat of flat number 6. My eyes searched the door, and I noticed there was no letterbox, or rather, that the letterbox had been boarded up. I didn't need to point out the envelope to my wife. You couldn't miss it. A neat, white rectangle, yellowish at the edges, sitting unobtrusively on the doormat. She gave a puzzled frown, looked curiously at it a while, and then made for a start as if to go look at it. I caught her by the arm immediately, for some reason. "What's up?" she asked, even more surprised by my reaction than the envelope. "Don't," I began, clearing my throat and not letting go of her, nor letting the envelope out of my sight. "Leave it." She looked at me with kind of a pitying smile, shook her head, and told me that I was being silly. But she listened, thankfully. She listened. I sighed and thanked her. I just didn't want her to go anywhere near the letter. It didn't feel right. I got a strange call that day at work, during my lunch hour. I had just finished my smoked salmon sandwich, and was about to tuck into a cookie when my phone began to ring. It wasn't unexpected or anything, because I get calls all the time when I'm at work from colleagues. It wasn't a colleague. I could tell as much. "Hello? Who's this?" I asked quite clearly, but all I could hear was the crackly hiss that you hear in the background of a call. "Hello? Hello?" I asked. Then I can swear I heard laughter, kind of a gleeful snigger, as if it might be some teenager prank calling me. But I was sure it wasn't a teenager. It sounded old, kind of weird. I was a little weirded out, so I hung up and checked the number. Strangely enough, the number was very similar to the number of our flat, but 2 digits were different. I guess it's a neighbor or something, maybe the estate agent, I told myself, but I wasn't so sure. The estate agent wouldn't have laughed at me like that. Then something else weird happened. I got home before my wife, and was just turning the key in the lock, and something made me look back. The envelope on the doorstep of number 6. It was gone. I stared hard at the door for a while, and it seemed to stare back at me. My imagination threatened to scare me, so I opened the door to my own flat as quick as I could and shut it behind me. I remember I felt a little anxious for my wife to get back soon. Something about the letter being gone had creeped me out. Somebody was living in that flat number 6, and they came out to pick up the envelope while I had been away. I turned on the TV and made myself a quick cup of tea, sitting, brooding, and not really watching the screen as I waited for my wife's return. When she came back, I had told her to wait in the flat while I checked something outside. It was pretty abrupt and unexplained, but she waited while I ran down the stairs and out of the building to check the windows of flat number 6. I saw that the curtains were drawn, and the panes had been in need of a clean for ages. When I got back to the flat, my wife had also noticed the absence of the letter. She was just standing at our doorway, pointing at the doormat of flat 6. "Have you seen—" "Yeah, I know," I butted in. "There's somebody there. I'm pretty sure there is." She strode up to the door of number 6 and was about to ring the bell when I cried out to her, "Don't do it!" "What's up with you, Matt?" She looked at me in a slightly concerned way and raised a hand to ring the doorbell. "Please don't. I don't like it," I protested like a child. "I seriously don't get you sometimes," she shook her head. "This is stupid. I'm gonna ring it." And she did. We listened, her calm and ready to greet whomever it was, and me, tense and not sure if I wanted to meet them. As I had half expected, nobody answered or even seemed to move inside the house. If the whole envelope incident hadn't taken place, then we would have been convinced it was empty. What the hell? There's nobody there. I suppose they're out, my wife assumed that in her realistic, matter-of-fact way. Out? I protested. They've never been out as long as we've been here. There's somebody in there, alright, but they're some kind of antisocial weirdo. Either that or they just died a while after they picked up the letter. I don't know why I said the last bit, but it got me even more freaked out. "Maybe, Matt," my wife began as we made our way back into our own flat, and then she turned the living room light on. "Maybe there's nobody there and the caretaker simply picked up the letter as it hadn't been taken." I wasn't 100% convinced, but that was fine with me. I liked that explanation a lot more, so we stuck with it and ate dinner. "Oh, and by the way," my wife asked me later as we got into bed, "did you get a call today at about 2 o'clock? "Yeah, a weird one with some guy laughing?" "Yeah, I got something like that too." "You did? Who do you reckon it was? Not many people here have our numbers, you know." "I'm not sure. I expect it was the estate agent's kids playing pranks. Maybe got our numbers off their dad's phone." I agreed, but I didn't stop thinking about that until I fell asleep. I dreamt about flat 6 that night. I dreamt that I opened the door to it and could see only the pitch darkness inside. I dreamt that I listened in and heard that same sniggering laughter coming from somewhere in the darkness. On Tuesday night, I came home to find that I had forgotten my keys and that my phone had run out of battery. You can imagine how frustrated I was when I found out my wife wasn't home, and that I had to wait on the landing for her to get back and open the door. You can imagine how anxious I grew when she wasn't back within an hour of her usual time, and that I couldn't get through to her. And I bet you can imagine how uneasy I got as I sat on the landing, within 3 yards of the door to flat number 6. You know when you're alone and vulnerable to getting spooked, you seem to think of the last things you would like to spring to your mind when you're feeling tense. Last night's dream, for instance, kept playing upon my mind, and I thought that at any moment the door to number 6 would burst open and something would come out and see me, and I would see it. Clearly, my wife was trying to get through to me, as I could hear the telephone ringing inside our apartment. She expected that I had got home. I was glad that she was alright and able to ring me, but it made me nervous to think that she was probably getting anxious about me as well. Then I looked at flat number 6's door again, and I swear I heard a click, a tiny noise coming from inside that apartment. I frowned and listened closely, but didn't hear anything else. After that, I went outside to escape the dreaded landing for a while. She still wasn't back and it was 9:30. Heavy rain started and forced me back inside and up the landing. I was almost considering asking a neighbor for a phone to call her, yes, at that time of night. But to my great relief, a little after 10 o'clock, she came up the steps to the landing and was startled to see me slumped on the floor on the door outside. "Thank goodness, I was starting to get worried about you. Where have you been?" I got up and spoke rapidly, catching my breath. My colleague offered to drive me home, but the traffic was horrendous at the time. "I tried to call your mobile, but it's out of battery, isn't it?" "What about you? Why aren't you inside?" I explained apologetically that I must have forgotten the keys inside the apartment that morning. She sighed and unlocked the door, and we stepped in. While I searched for my keys, they were strangely not on the key hook. My wife turned on the lights, and I heard her gasp a little at the answering machine. "Look how many missed calls are on the telephone." "Yeah, you must have been calling me non-stop," I told her. "I only called you twice on the home phone. There are like 6 missed calls and—" "Hang on. Come over here." "What is it?" I hurried to see what had put the worried expression on her face. I looked at the numbers for the missed calls. 2 of them were from my wife's mobile phone number, and the other 4 numbers were the same number. It's the same number as those weird prank calls we got yesterday." She seemed now more irritated than nervous. "God damn kids." She deleted the missed calls, and we went to bed without dinner. It was a bit late, and we were both exhausted. I never found those missing keys. Wednesday was worse. I got more calls from that number, but the hoarse, unfriendly voice at the other end was saying things now. I was shocked, intimidated even, by what I was hearing. The voice was saying the most vilest things, talking about rape, murder, and pretty much using every swear word in the book. The thing that really scared me about the calls were how much the person on the other end seemed to know about us. He knew my name, my wife's name, and that we were from the States, and he referred to us as filthy Yanks more than once. I made up my mind to report this fellow at some point, and as I was on my bus home, I blocked his number. There was peace for a while, and just when I thought I wouldn't hear any more from that nasty, irritating son of a bitch, my phone rang again. I was amazed to see what I thought was the same goddamn number calling, but then I realized it wasn't that number. It was our number. Somebody was calling me from my own home. I picked up and asked frantically if it was my wife at the other end. That ominous crackling sound followed, then that same mocking, sniggering laughter. It took me a few seconds to register how serious the situation was. When I did, I almost vomited with anxiety. I jumped off the bus, sprinted home, burst up the flights of stairs, and came up to the landing where I collapsed with sheer, utter terror. The door to number 5 was open. "Oh my God!" I cried aloud and staggered to my feet, rushing into my flat to catch the intruder. There was nobody there when I looked, so I rushed out of number 5 and broke the door down to number 6 by force. Hell, I would have gone in there and showed that thing what happened to people who mess with me. But when I saw that bare, empty, dimly lit hallway beyond the door, I could not force myself to enter that place. I was a coward. I collapsed and fainted. The police searched the flat number 6 very thoroughly when they entered, and also looked around our flat as me and my wife stood on the landing between and just stared into space. We felt violated, as if somebody was deliberately trying to make us feel unwelcome in our own home. She even suggested moving out, which was drastic. I don't blame her. She had received a few of those calls lately as well. We were reassured, if not a little frustrated, when the police claimed that they had not found anybody in either of the flats. Interestingly, flat 6 had been empty after all. We ourselves even took a look around in there and found absolutely no traces of anybody living in there. There wasn't a phone in flat 6 either, so whoever was calling us couldn't have been living there. Further investigation showed that the envelope had actually been meant for Miss Miggins in number 4 downstairs, and she had checked upstairs because her son who sent the letter had, in the past, mistakenly addressed his letters to number 6. My fears about flat 6 had obviously been sheer paranoia. There was nothing to worry about, so it seemed, in flat 6. As for my keys, they were found lying on the landing outside the flat. The intruder had obviously dropped them there before he had made his getaway. We gave the police the number that had been troubling us, and they told us sincerely that they'd have it looked into, and arrest the perpetrator for breaking and entering, as well as for going against the 1988 Malicious Communications Act. More or less reassured as a person can be after having their home broken into, we both thanked the ruddy-faced inspector and the 4 constables before bidding them good night and closing our front door. We sighed and fell wearily onto the sofa and watched the TV for a while. It was some kind of sitcom, Faulty Towers I think it was called. We fixed ourselves a small dinner and watched in front of the telly, laughing at the bits we found funny, and laughing anyway at the bits that weren't too funny. At about 11:30 we turned off the TV, washed the dishes, and turned in for the night. Settled into bed, I was about to turn off the bedside lamp when my wife told me to wait a little. She had her mobile phone in her hand and a kind of smirk on her face. "Why don't we give the prank caller a little taste of his own medicine?" she suggested. "He won't like being called up at this time of night." "Sure, do it," I said, liking the idea as soon as I heard it. "What are you going to say to him?" "I don't know. Suppose I'll just make creepy noises or something. Anything to get back at him." "Sure, go ahead." She dialed the number, and we were chuckling to ourselves gleefully as she called. We were quiet a while, grinning stupidly when the phone connected. Then a noise from our living room wiped the smiles right off our faces. A phone had started to ring in the living room.